This audio program by Radio AI is generated using artificial intelligence technologies. The voices you hear in this program are synthetic, and the thoughts they express are shaped through artificial intelligence-driven reasoning and iterative refinement.
Welcome to Radio AI. Today, we're jumping into a really fundamental question, one that probably resonates with everyone listening. Why do we fear the unknown? It sounds simple, but it's really not, is it? I mean, the unknown isn't just one single thing. It could be anything from, weird noise downstairs at night to thinking about the huge uncertainties of the future and how we react. Well, that's all over the place too. So this isn't going to be a simple answer. It feels incredibly complex, almost like it's woven into the very fabric of being human.
It absolutely is. And the fact that we keep asking this question, that it persists across cultures and time, that tells you its roots go very, very deep. We're talking about individual psychology, sure, but also our shared history, our evolution.
Yeah.
This response, let's call it, to the unknown, it doesn't just spring from one place. It's more like a mosaic, isn't it? Bits of evolution, bits of how our brain works, social factors, our environment. Sometimes these things even seem to push in different directions inside our own minds and societies.
Okay, a mosaic. I like that. Let's try and look at some of those pieces then, maybe starting with the psychological side, because that feeling of needing things to be predictable, that feels very real, very immediate. What happens in our minds when something just pops up that we didn't expect? When it disrupts that need for order?
Well, that disruption is key. Psychologists talk about our need for cognitive stability. The unknown can feel like a direct, a fundamental threat to that stability. You see, we humans, we rely heavily on these established mental frameworks. You might have heard them called schemas.
Schemas, right? Like mental models or blueprints.
Exactly. They help us organize everything we experience, make sense of it all, and crucially, predict what's likely to happen next. Our brain is constantly trying to, fill in the blanks based on past experience. So when we encounter something totally new, something that just resists being put into any of our existing mental boxes.
It doesn't fit the blueprint.
Precisely. That predictability just shatters. And that failure to categorize, that inability to make sense of it smoothly, that often triggers a feeling of unease. Or sometimes, full-blown anxiety. There's even a term for when this gets really pronounced. Intolerance of uncertainty. It's basically a tendency to feel anxious in ambiguous situations where the outcome isn't clear.
So just the ambiguity itself is the problem?
Often, yes. Now, some lab studies do suggest that ambiguous cues can increase physiological arousal, make your heart beat faster, that on-edge feeling. But the exact details, how universal that is, it's still being actively researched. Lots of factors influence it. What's clear is that ambiguity often trips a kind of primal alarm in the brain.
That makes so much sense. The brain is a pattern matcher, getting frustrated when there's no pattern. Okay, let's zoom out a bit then to the bigger picture of evolution. Why would evolution kind of build in this cautious response?
Well, the thinking is that it likely had real adaptive value. From an evolutionary standpoint, being cautious about new things, novel stimuli, ambiguous situations probably helped our ancestors survive.
How so?
Imagine early humans. If you were the one who hesitated before eating a strange new berry, or maybe was wary of rustling in the bushes you didn't recognize.
You might avoid poison or a predator.
Exactly. You'd be less likely to run into danger. So those cautious tendencies theoretically would get passed on more readily, survival of the cautious in a way. But what's really fascinating, and this is where it gets complex, is that we seem to have these two competing tendencies living side by side.
Competing?
Yeah. We have neophobic tendencies. That's the fear of novelty, but also neophilic tendencies. An attraction to novelty, curiosity.
The urge to explore versus the urge to stay safe.
Precisely. And the balance is tricky. Some research hints that maybe getting exposed to manageable new things early on can reduce fear later. But honestly, the evidence is complex. It's really hard to untangle what's inherited from what's learned. And think about it, too much fear of the new, and maybe your group misses out on vital resources or helpful alliances. It's a very fine line.
So we're kind of caught in this evolutionary tug of war. We've got the brain's immediate reaction, the deep evolutionary roots. But what about those fears that aren't about a specific berry or noise? The bigger stuff. That kind of leads us into philosophy, doesn't it? Thinkers have often talked about different kinds of fear. It's not all the same.
That's a really important distinction. Philosophers often separate what they call immediate pragmatic fears from a deeper existential anxiety.
Okay, what's the difference there?
Pragmatic fears are tied to specific risks you can point to. Fear of spiders, fear of failing an exam, fear of public speaking. There's a concrete thing you're afraid of. Existential anxiety, though, that's different. It's more of a background hum of unease. It comes from just being aware of the big, unavoidable limits of being human. Like knowing we're mortal. Or the fact that the future is ultimately unknowable. Or maybe grappling with questions of meaning in a vast universe. It's less about an immediate threat and more about the basic conditions of our existence.
Wow. Okay. That's a heavier kind of unknown.
It can be. And how we frame that bigger unknown, whether we see it mostly as something to dread or maybe as a space for wonder, a growth that's shaped by a lot of things. Yeah. Our cultural background plays a huge role, of course, but so do our individual sort of neuropsychological traits. Well, there's this concept called psychological flexibility. It's basically the capacity to adapt your thinking and behavior when things are uncertain or changing. People or cultures that actively cultivate things like curiosity or acceptance towards uncertainty, they can actually build this flexibility. It's seen as linked to resilience, maybe creativity, openness.
So instead of just bracing against the unknown, you learn to kind of roll with it or even lean into it.
Something like that, yeah. It's an adaptive capacity. It allows some people not just to cope, but potentially even to thrive when things are unpredictable.
That idea of flexibility feels really key, especially today. And brings us back to the brain again. You mentioned earlier, the brain is like a predictive engine. Can you unpack that a bit more? How does that prediction system tie into all this?
Right, the predictive engine idea. It's central to a theory called predictive coding in neuroscience. The basic idea is our brain isn't just passively taking in sights and sounds.
It's guessing.
It's constantly guessing. It generates expectations about what's going to happen next based on its internal models of the world.
Okay.
Then it compares those predictions to what actually comes in through our senses. If there's a mismatch, if reality doesn't line up with the prediction that generates what's called a prediction error.
An error. Sounds bad.
Not necessarily. Prediction errors are actually crucial for learning. They're the signal that tells the brain, hey, your model needs updating. Something unexpected happened.
Ah, okay.
Okay?
So errors help us learn.
Exactly. But when things are highly unpredictable, when the world keeps throwing curveballs, you get more prediction errors. And some research suggests that a high rate of these errors can be linked to increased arousal, maybe anxiety.
Like the brain is saying, whoa, I can't keep up. Too many surprises.
Kind of, yes. It's like the system gets overwhelmed. But here's where individual differences come back in again. Someone with a higher tolerance for uncertainty might experience those same prediction errors not as stressful, but as interlative.
As opportunities.
As opportunities to learn, yeah. Maybe even exciting. So our interpretation, again, plays a massive role in how we actually feel about the brain's predictive misses. The full picture is still being mapped out, though.
So our individual brains are constantly trying to predict and getting feedback when they're wrong. But this isn't just happening inside our own heads, is it? What about groups? How do whole societies handle big unknowns?
That's where sociocultural factors become so important. Societies don't leave individuals to face uncertainty alone. They develop collective ways of managing it.
Like what?
Think about rituals, myths, shared narratives, social norms. These are all, in a way, collective tools for making sense of the unpredictable and managing the anxiety it can cause.
So if there's a drought, a society might develop a rain dance ritual or a myth explaining why the rain stopped.
Precisely. Or elaborate funeral rites to deal with the ultimate unknown of death. Anthropologists see these kinds of practices becoming more prominent when a society feels like it's facing high levels of uncertainty. They provide structure, a sense of shared understanding, maybe even perceived control. But of course, they vary hugely across cultures. Some traditions might really emphasize caution, warning against straying from the known path.
While others might celebrate exploration.
Exactly. Some might value exploration, maybe even seeing controlled exposure to the unknown as a way to gain wisdom or strength. And it's worth noting, these collective strategies don't always just reduce fear.
How do you mean?
Well, sometimes the explanation created to manage one unknown, like blaming an illness on witchcraft, can actually introduce new fears and anxieties into the community. It's complex. These cultural layers interact deeply with individual psychology and philosophical views.
It really shows how we try to collectively impose order, but sometimes create new problems.
Okay, so we've established it's complex, it's layered. But you mentioned earlier, not everyone reacts with intense fear. Some people seem almost drawn to the unknown. What's going on there?
Right, those individual differences are fascinating. Psychology has identified certain personality traits or profiles. For example, people who score high on sensation seeking.
Looking for thrills.
Yeah, basically a drive for novel, varied, intense experiences. Them, or people with what's called low anxiety sensitivity, they aren't overly troubled by the physical feelings of anxiety itself. These individuals might actively seek out unpredictable situations. They might even thrive on them.
The adventurers, the entrepreneurs.
Could be. They might find a certain kind of stability in change, paradoxically. But then on the flip side, you have individuals with high anxiety sensitivity.
Who fear the anxiety itself. Exactly. They tend to interpret those physical sensations of anxiety as dangerous or harmful. For them, or for individuals with certain neurodevelopmental conditions, the unknown, the ambiguous, can feel acutely threatening. It can trigger intense distress and lead to avoidance.
So it's a spectrum, really.
Definitely a spectrum. And it's crucial to remember, these are just patterns, not definitive boxes. The reasons behind these differences, genetics, upbringing, life experiences, are still being actively researched. It's not about one way being right and another wrong.
Which brings us right up to today. We live in a time of incredibly rapid change, especially with technology, AI. How is all this affecting our relationship with the unknown? Are we generating new unknowns faster than we can adapt?
That is a huge question right now, and honestly, there's a lot of debate. Many theorists argue that this era of rapid technological change, think AI, big data, the constant flood of information online, is fundamentally altering what the unknown even means.
In what way?
Well, we're facing new kinds of uncertainty. Information overload makes it hard to know what's true. Digital spaces can be incredibly ambiguous, and technologies like AI can behave in ways even their creators don't fully predict or understand. That's a novel kind of risk.
A black box unknown.
Sort of, yes. And the perspectives on the impact differ wildly. Some worry that the sheer pace of it all might be overwhelming our traditional coping mechanisms, leading to widespread anxiety or exhaustion. Others are more optimistic, suggesting that maybe this constant exposure forces us to become more adaptable, more psychologically flexible, building resilience on a larger scale.
So we don't really know yet how it'll shake out.
The long-term evidence just isn't there yet. It's still emerging. How society and individuals will ultimately adapt to these new forms of uncertainty? Well, that's one of the big unknowns we're currently living through.
So wrapping this up, it seems clear that fearing the unknown isn't just some simple switch in our brain. It's this incredibly dynamic thing, right? Shaped by our deep past, our individual minds, how our brains literally work, the stories and structures of our societies, and now increasingly by the technology we create.
Absolutely. And it's vital to remember that fear isn't the only response. Curiosity, creativity, the drive to explore, these are just as human, and they exist right alongside the fear. They all mix together, shaped by who we are as individuals, as groups, and the world we find ourselves in. It's always a blend.
Yeah. That encounter with the unknown, it's clearly not just about dread. It seems like it's something absolutely fundamental to being alive, something that constantly pushes us, shapes our thinking, our cultures, our actions, often in really surprising ways. Which maybe leaves us with a thought. It's not just why we react to the unknown, but maybe how we choose to engage with it. So think about the unknowns you're facing right now. Are you meeting them with caution? With curiosity? Maybe a bit of both.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive on Radio AI. We really hope this conversation gave you some things to think about. We would genuinely love to hear your own reflections and thoughts down in the comments section. Until next time, keep exploring those fascinating corners of what we don't yet know.